How do we stop sperm and egg from meeting? We have a number of sophisticated ways. This has been a problem that people have been trying to solve since humans have existed. For the most part, we are reproductive creatures. We want to reproduce. We are designed to reproduce. But we have the forethought. Humans, other animals do this as well, but humans have especially gotten good at this because we're good at planning for the long term, for thinking about what we want our future to look like. And so people have been trying to develop ways to offset pregnancy when it's not wanted. So some general thoughts too. So contraception, birth control, just a fancy way of saying birth control. This can be condoms, these can be diaphragms, spermicides, hormonal birth control, IUDs. We'll go over all these different techniques by the end of this section. But why should we want to limit birth? Why would we want to limit reproduction? Well, first off, it can be a matter of health and safety. Not every pregnancy, or not every potential pregnancy, is something that would be healthy for an individual. If you have a child when you're much younger, there is a greater risk for complication. Or if you have a child later in life, maybe a woman has not yet gone through menopause, such that the menstrual cycle isn't occurring, but it's later in life, and to some degree, the chance of genetic abnormalities increases when a woman gets older. So it's possible that you'd want to limit it just because you know, for one reason or another, it may not be safe for the mother or for the child. The other thing you can use, so that would be infant well-being. The other thing you can use these for are STI prevention. So many of the birth controls that we're going to talk about don't prevent against STIs, which are sexually transmitted infections, things like herpes, syphilis, HIV, etc. But condoms do. Condoms do prevent STIs from being spread if used correctly. And also when we talk about hormone-based contraception, turns out there are a number of health benefits to using hormone-based contraception, like birth control pills, the IUD, and several other options that are available. Avoidance of unintended pregnancy, and that's a big one, right? Sometimes people just don't want to get pregnant. Even if they're healthy, even if they would be capable of having a child, it may not fit with your plans. Recreation as well. Sex, we've realized, is pleasurable. It is one of the things that humans really want the most in many cases. And sometimes we want it without the chance of having a child because of it. So contraception helps with that as well. And then social mobility. This is just a reality for most people. Unless you come from a very rich family, where if you get pregnant and have a child, you can just hand that child off to a maid or someone else to take care of the child, it's going to affect social mobility. Women who have children are expensive. Children require a fair amount of care time. And so if you have a child, you will probably be spending a considerable portion of your life caring for that child, rather than doing other things that would affect your social mobility. That is, getting a high-paying job, or gaining social status within the communities that are important to you, doing good works in the community, things like that. You can certainly do both, but it becomes harder to do these things when you have a child, unless you have the right circumstances to support your independence despite that child. Okay, some history of contraception. It was available, these have existed for hundreds of years. There's a long history of contraception. Back in the day, before kind of the medical contraceptive techniques, people would find certain types of plants that were known to cause abortion. And so women would eat these plants, or they would process them into an elixir or whatnot that would be consumable, that you could safely consume, and that it would cause abortion. Now those can be relatively more unreliable, and they can be dangerous in some cases, depending on what kind of plant you're using. So with medical advances, we've created all kinds of different contraceptions within the past 100 years or so, a little bit longer than that. The person who brought contraception to the US, the United States, was someone named Margaret Sanger. She was a very influential figure within the feminist movement. And she brought, during the 20th century, she brought many contraceptive techniques over from Europe. So Europe had them far before the United States did. The United States, being a relatively more religious, conservative society, just traditionally, was not as receptive to contraception, or did not put as much effort into that as Europe did. And so she brought that over and introduced it. Now, contraception is widely available. There are still dry areas, places where people do not reliably get contraception, but at least in the US, if you want condoms, you're probably going to be able to find them. I'll tell you this, you can find 100 count of condoms on Amazon. Don't ever buy, condoms in like a gas station or anything. They're overpriced. Even in Walmart, they're overpriced. What you should do is order them from somewhere, from the internet. You can get 100 pack of them for like $12. It's a far more cost-effective strategy for getting condoms. So they're widely available now. And yet, despite how widely available they are, about less than half of all pregnancies that occur seem to be wanted. Right? So of all the children being born, or at least the pregnancies, of all the pregnancies that occur, whether the child eventually gets born or not, less than half of them are wanted, which is kind of staggering. Most of them end up being spontaneous abortions or induced abortions. That is, they were unwanted and therefore induced, or unwanted or mistimed births. That is, people just didn't really want the child. Maybe they eventually had it, but it was mistimed for them. And so the reason this happens is in part because people may not be using birth control, but they also may not be using it correctly. And that's the big part. When you use contraception, when you decide which one you wish to use to prevent pregnancy, there are a number of considerations that you need to make. First, different contraceptions have different reliabilities. That is, how effectively do they prevent pregnancy? If used correctly, most STI methods will prevent them. However, some are more reliable than others, and we'll see why in a second. For example, spermicide by itself is not going to prevent pregnancy, usually. You have to combine it with something else. Condoms are only as effective as the person who uses them. If you use them incorrectly, they're not as reliable anymore. Some are more safe than others. So some types of contraception you will influence your body in some way. For example, hormonal contraception, where you are actually changing the concentration of various hormones within your body, can affect your health to some degree. Or sterilization, you're actually having a surgery to change your fertility. Those things are relatively more invasive. Some of them are more reversible. Whether you put a condom on or then you take that condom off, you are reversing whether you're using that contraception. Birth control, you can reverse it, but it'll take a little bit of time, especially if you've been using it for a while. And sterilization, where you go in and you snip the vas deferens of connecting the testes to the rest of the body, or tie fallopian tubes, those things tend to be either very hard to reverse or almost impossible to reverse. Condoms are the only ones that have STI protection, so if you use birth control pills, you can still get an STI. So that is something that you always have to be aware of. Some of them are easier to use. We'll talk about rings, the vaginal rings that are hormonal, and you insert them in the vagina and you keep them there. They can be kind of a nuisance. They kind of float around in there, and during sex, some people report being able to feel them. So some of them are less easy to use. Female condoms are pretty uneasy to use. They are essentially, they can feel like you're just kind of placing a large kind of rubber bag within the vaginal canal, and then it creates a certain type of friction that may not be very desirable during sex. So you have to consider that as well. Some people don't like using condoms in general because they dull sensation, which is just an unfortunate reality of condoms. And then some of them are more costly than others. So the one thing that I really want to emphasize on reliability is that the reliability of methods varies considerably, and it usually depends on what's called the difference between what's called typical use and perfect use. So the failure rate tends to be higher with typical use than with perfect use. For example, oral contraceptives, hormone-based birth control pills, have less than a 1% chance if you use them perfectly as they're intended. But typically, people have about an 8% chance of failure. And it's because people don't take the pill every day. They don't stay on that schedule. Compare that to implants. Implants that are something that don't require human input at all. So what you have here are the perfect use rate is the typical use rate, because the person using this has no control over whether it's working or not. If something is implanted under your skin, which we'll talk about, that implant will just work as it's intended to. And same with an IUD. An IUD is going to be inserted into the uterus, and you don't have to worry about it for, depending on which type you use, 5 to 12 years. So it's just going to do its job passively. This has the best failure rate. This is the lowest. And this is, if you don't want to get pregnant, these are really the techniques that you may want to look at, especially if you're forgetful. But again, condoms are the only one to protect against STIs. I can't say that enough, just in case anyone gets the wrong idea about condoms. Okay, let's begin our tour of contraception. I'm actually going to stop this video here and then pick it up next time on this slide, just to kind of break things up a little bit.